Prime Ministers, ambassadors, ministers, members of the Parliament, and distinguished guests. On behalf of the board of Harvard Business School Club of Greece, we would like to thank you for joining us tonight. We will listen, analyze, and debate a new economic and societal model for Europe and Greece, based on grassroots innovation and entrepreneurship, which could provide economic growth, employment, job satisfaction, and mass flourishing. During the last few years, Greece, Europe, and the world have witnessed the collapse of the dominant economic model. As we painfully observed in Greece, economic growth does not accurately represent a useful measure of the nation's economic dynamism. Our growth model was based on consumer consumption, supported by overinflated government borrowing. Greece is currently undergoing a triple crisis: an economic crisis, a political crisis, and a societal crisis. Nonetheless, behind this crisis, there is a deeply rooted cultural crisis, a crisis of values and ideas that keeps Greece hostage. At this critical juncture for our country, we welcome Nobel laureate Professor Edmund Phelps, a global authority in economics. His first visit to Greece coincides with a turn in our thinking as to how our society can exit the crisis and recapture its depleted economic dynamism. Professor Phelps will argue, through his extensive study of economics and economic history, that grassroots indigenous innovation is the cornerstone for a nation's economic dynamism, which leads to mass flourishing. He is inspired by the humanities and by the Aristotelian concept of eudaimonia, mass flourishing. Mass flourishing that comes from the broad involvement of people in the process of innovation. By grassroots innovation, we do not mean only the high-tech innovations, but the innovations by all the ordinary people in all industries, the innumerable new products, processes, as well as improvements to existing ones. He will also explain to us the reasons why some of the countries develop dynamic economies, driven by innovation and inspiration, while others, they lag far behind, and why the main obstacle for these people's accomplishments and individual innovation is corporatism. In this challenging intellectual journey, Professor Phelps will not be alone tonight. It is our great honor to have with us Professor Loukas Papadimos, former Prime Minister of Greece, in one of the most turbulent periods in the recent history of Europe and Greece. He possesses a profound knowledge of European central banking and economy and a unique policy-making perspective of the Greek economy and society. So Professor Papadimos will focus on how we can achieve stronger growth in Europe, given the institutional, structural, and fiscal constraints that we face and the persisting adverse financial conditions in several countries. We have the Minister of Finance and well-known economist, Professor Gikas Hardouvelis, which will present to us the policies, measures, and structural changes that Greece is implementing or plans to introduce in order to develop a new model of economic growth and societal well-being. Though recently removed to the new challenges, the former Minister of Development and Competitiveness, Mr. Nikos Dendias, has developed a dynamic framework of legislation and a series of financial instruments that will provide liquidity and support for the spark of innovation in Greece. We will also be inspired by Kostas Apostolidis, first and mostly a Harvard Business School alumnus, and the CEO of RakeUp Corporation. He will present the standard of values, the challenges, and the decisions that made RakeUp's innovation and creativity an inspiring example and motivation for Greek entrepreneurs, and earn for RakeUp a nomination by the European Union as the leading high-tech company of Greece for 2014. Professor Phelps.
Prime Ministers, ambassadors, distinguished guests, dear friends, Mr. Zavos, it is a very great honor to have this opportunity to speak here tonight on Greece and Europe. Discussions of the economy in recent decades, at least, attempt to reduce the economy to the mechanics of supply and demand. Supply-siders focused on supply blame the value-added taxes for the new recession in Japan and blame corporate profits taxes for the weakness of investment in the US. Keynesians focused on demand blame fiscal austerity for the failure of Greece, Italy, and Portugal to recover. Of course, policies can cause harm. I myself argued that policies contributed to the crisis that hit Greece and Italy. However, some wider forces must be at work in Southern Europe and Europe generally, since investment and employment are depressed all over Western Europe and the US too. Slow growth of the productivity of labor and capital combined, which is what economists call total factor productivity, or TFP, lies behind much of the weakness of business investment and hence employment, especially in Europe and worst of all, in Southern Europe. Slower growth of TFP leads to lower business investment activity, and that costs jobs. Slow growth of TFP also causes wealth to get ahead of incomes. And as I noted before, as I would have noted before had I had time to say it, a rise of the wealth-income ratio tends to contract labor supply and thus employment. Governments ultimately worsen matters by prescribing stimulants. Economists have lost sight of the slow growth phenomenon, yet it is real and revealing. I believe that new forces of slow growth were beginning to operate in Britain and Germany by the 1950s, though they were, of course, obscured by the huge rebuilding going on until the post-war reconstruction wound down. Slow growth of productivity came to the US around 1970. It was visible and caused the famous malaise. That was ominous since gains in US productivity had always led, sooner or later, to productivity gains in Europe. And in fact, productivity growth did indeed virtually stop in France and Italy by the late 1990s, and in Germany and Britain a few years later. In Greece, productivity rose sharply in the post-war decades, but slow growth returned in the 70s. You know these data better than I do, but I think that they're reasonably accurate. What lies behind this slow growth? The rapid productivity growth that Britain and America sustained from early in the 19th century to the middle 20th century, and Germany and France sustained beginning a few decades later, was a result of indigenous innovation right down to the grassroots of society. Virtually everyone in the economy was thinking about new and better products and methods. Similarly, the slow growth in Europe and the only somewhat less slow growth in America results from a dearth of indigenous grassroots innovating. The dearth of grassroots innovating in Europe was not fatal to European productivity growth as long as America was making grassroots innovation. But by the 1970s, America was no longer doing the large volume of grassroots innovating that it once did. There was only the elite innovating in Silicon Valley and Route 128. So my first proposition is that if Europe, or America, wants to have more than the modicum of innovation that can be hoped to result from the elites, it will need to generate its own grassroots innovation. Everybody will have to get into the act. Now, I said if Europe wants to have more innovation. That's a big if. Many young Americans, and I'm sure young Europeans too, do not believe that productivity growth and the wage growth that depends on it is any longer very important. They see the breathtaking opportunities that most consumers already have, living in rich cities, taking exotic vacations, and so forth. I agree that wage growth is not the most important thing. On the other hand, many economists would justify further productivity growth on the thinking that it would make it possible for low-wage workers to afford costly medicines and costly schools that they cannot do now. Or it would help the state afford better national defense. In my book, Mass Flourishing, I point to some powerful grounds, some different grounds and powerful grounds for indigenous grassroots innovation. Most people want to have their careers in an economy in which they can prosper. What does that mean exactly? Well, we say that a person is prospering if the person is creating or discovering ways to obtain better terms for his work or her work. This sort of material achievement is very gratifying to people. I first heard that idea from Kenneth Boulding many decades ago. It is only in an economy high in grassroots innovation that lots of people are prospering. In the age of discovery, a nation might acquire treasuries from explorations overseas, but very few people were prospering in those times. Many people also want to work in an economy in which they can flourish, to use Aristotle's word. We say that someone is flourishing if the person is engaged in the unfolding experience of the work he or she does, taking part in solving new problems, creating new things, and fascinated by the journey. And flourishing if the person is developing in the course of this work. This sort of career is profoundly rewarding to a great many people. And it can only come from homegrown innovation in which everybody participates, figuratively speaking. Only from indigenous innovation down to the grassroots. For me, at any rate, this is the life. And this was the life offered by the highly innovative economies that started up in the 19th century. Massive numbers of people were observing, tinkering, imagining, conceiving, creating, experimenting, testing, and marketing. And as new products came out, people were examining them, trying them out, and venturing to adopt them. So my second proposition is that there are powerful reasons to want to have economies high in indigenous grassroots innovation. The question before us then is what Europe in general, and Greece in particular, will need to do to develop such economies. What is required for an economy to be high in grassroots innovation? Well, imagination and creativity are essential fuel. Fortunately, mankind has that. But they are not sufficient. For this high innovation, a society must possess dynamism, must possess the dynamism needed to spark the fuel. By the way, I like the word dynamism because we need something that's not exactly the same thing as innovation. Dynamism is necessary for innovation, but not sufficient. Market conditions may not be propitious, and an unlucky macro development may derail most innovative projects. So there is a distinction between the dynamism necessary for innovation and the innovation itself. The dynamism behind indigenous innovation is a culture that indulges and encourages imagining, creating, venturing, and exploring. I point to three cultural elements that are critical to high dynamism in a nation. To have a broad flow of innovation, society has to allow businesses wide latitude to innovate. There is little leeway for innovations if society is unwilling to put up with the disruption or inconvenience that often accompanies innovation. In a corporatist society, about which I will say more later, there is a web of social protection that hinders innovation. In such a society, it is considered right to say no to outsiders with new ideas, no matter how innovative. A community, in such a society, a community is entitled to bar a new airport or bar a shopping mall. The government is entitled to put up regulations that have the latent function of protecting established companies from the threat of innovative outsiders. Government contracts may have the same latent function. Governments may feel free to operate a cartel that removes incentives to innovate that would have gained market share. How capable a nation is at innovating depends on its attitudes, depends on further attitudes. Innovators tend to be people who tend to question prevailing beliefs and think out of the box. So there have to be those sorts of entrepreneurs. There have to be financiers with enough experience to feel confident that they can judge well enough the innovative projects submitted to them. Aspiring innovators have to feel they have sufficient insight to warrant making a try. In a corporatist society, a startup entrepreneur would have to fear condemnation by society in the event the enterprise failed, because in corporatism, the individual firm is viewed as essentially a vessel of society and not the experiment of some individual. At the heart of dynamism, however, is the desire to innovate, despite the obstacles, or maybe in part because of the obstacles. Some innovators have a deep need to act on the world. Others want to demonstrate to society that they can go their own way. Some others are driven by a need to prove to themselves that they can succeed. Obviously, these motives and aspirations are not the work and save mentality that was part and parcel of mercantile capitalism. These aspirations and motives were stirred, I believe, by the modern values that began to emerge as early as the late Renaissance. The individualism of Pico della Mirandola and Luther, taking charge of one's life, which entails thinking for oneself and willingness to break from convention. Another value is the vitalism portrayed by Cellini, Cervantes, and Shakespeare, relishing challenges, surmounting obstacles, and making a mark. And the expressionism or experientialism that we find in Kierkegaard, for example, the fascination with venturing into the unknown. These modern values steered people to pursue careers offering personal growth, the becoming of Montaigne and Bergson. As people created the new, they created themselves. These modern values were in sharp contrast to the traditional values of medieval or even ancient times. Materialist values that undermine exploration for its own sake, communitarian values that oppose new businesses and new money, and family values that impede breaking away or taking big chances. In all the discussions of reform, I notice, it is supposed that it is the economy that needs fixing, that the spirit of a modern economy and the values that inspire it are still dominant. America is believed to remain at heart a nation of pioneers and innovators, Europe the home of mythic explorers and profound discoverers. But this spirit is part of an economy. It's the heart of an economy. That's what I meant when I started by saying that discussions are too mechanical. The corruption of government and of corporations is not simply the ineluctable consequence of self-interest. The self-interest that people have depend upon their values. The transmutation of the state and business that has occurred in recent decades is a result of a resurgence of the traditional values that we call corporatist values, which counter the influence of modern values. Let me say something more about corporatism, which is not a known thing in the United States, although I'm sure that Europeans are much more familiar with it. The values that constitute corporatism have been traced to the Corinthians in the New Testament, and they ruled the economies of the Middle Ages. The resurgence of corporatism from 1890 onwards, beginning with Ferdinand Tönnies and Georges Valois and Mussolini, disapproved of disorder, especially the topsy-turvy disorder that came with the modern economy. It disapproved of the ambitions of those without wealth, calling them money grubbers, and hated the new money that displaced established wealth. It disapproved of competition, preferring instead what it called solidarity, which led to the doctrine of social protection. Most fundamentally, corporatists deplored individualism, calling for a state that would bring harmony and nationalism in place of the individual's autonomy to take initiatives and even to innovate. Everyone was to go on working, accumulating wealth, and perhaps running a company. That is all seen to be for the good of society. Corporatism sanctions and even encourages materialism. But no one is permitted to hire the nation's labor and borrow the nation's wealth to embark on a venture aimed at discovery, innovation, and personal growth. Thus, corporatism was aimed at the modernism that was the root source of the spirit of the modern economy. Let me say something about materialism. Materialism has become a factor in the decline of dynamism in Europe and America. Of course, materialism is not an unalloyed evil, even if innovators sought only the thrill of their adventures, caring nothing about money. Each small increase in materialism in the society at large might be a plus up to a point. Some materialism helps to motivate working and investing in the society's economy, without which innovation cannot occur. However, materialism can go too far. In America, I know that college students display an increased focus on career, earning, wealth accumulation, and job stability. There is a widening rejection of a life of investigating, imagining, creating, experimenting, exploring, trying things, and hence innovation. This causes droves of students, this new materialism, this resurgent materialism, causes droves of students to seek employment in the financial sector with its jackpots, in preference to employment in small startup firms in which the expectation of material reward is much smaller. It could be said, then, that the recrudescence of materialism is a conspicuous part of the resurgence of corporatism, since corporatism is materialist. It appears, therefore, that there is little hope of reforming corporations and finance and reforming the government without at the same time removing the bad influences of corporatist values on the economy. Western nations will have to reassert their modern values. Furthermore, it is doubtful that the work of regaining the dynamism of the modern economies of yesteryear can be complete unless we instill more deeply the modern values on the spirit on which the spirit of a modern economy depends. A necessary step to that end is to restore the humanities and in university curricula. Much greater exposure to fiction and mythology, philosophy and history will inspire young people to seek a life of richness, one that includes making creative, innovative contributions to society. Greece, the country of Homer, Sophocles, and Aristotle, can do it. Thank you.
I would like to thank Professor Phelps for his inspiring call for innovation in our country. And now we are going to listen to Professor Papadimos.
Prime Minister, Excellencies, Ministers, distinguished guests, President of the Harvard Business School Club of Greece, Mr. Zavos, Professor Phelps, dear Ned, ladies and gentlemen, prosperity and dynamism. These are the two key words, the fundamental concepts that define the theme of today's meeting. Addressing this theme is very appropriate for Europe and Greece at the current juncture. A return to prosperity has proven to be an elusive objective over the past few years, and a deficit of dynamism is apparent in many parts of Europe. At present, following a protracted period of economic weakness and financial tensions, which in our country, as you know, were extraordinary, Europe is facing the prospect of secular stagnation in the years to come. What should be done to prevent this prospect from materializing? What should be done to establish a new and credible path to higher and viable growth? It's a pleasure for me to participate in this meeting of the Harvard Business School Club in Greece, and I'm especially glad to join in this event Professor Phelps, my former colleague for many years and a good friend. The former approach to the colleague, not to the friend. I believe we're still friends. The presentation of Professor Phelps was very stimulating and thoughtful, full of original and relevant ideas on how a nation's dynamism can spark innovation, create jobs, and reduce income inequality. I fully share the main tenets of his thesis on the role and significance of a nation's dynamism in enhancing economic and social welfare. The practical challenge for policymakers is how to generate greater dynamism and enhance its positive effects on innovation, employment, and more balanced growth. In Europe and in our country, addressing this challenge is more complicated and difficult for reasons that I will explain. But this observation should not discourage us, but it does mean that we have to try harder. Now, in my remarks, I would like to complement some of the points made by Professor Phelps by examining how we can achieve stronger growth in Europe, given the institutional, the structural, and the fiscal constraints that we face, and in view of persisting adverse financial conditions in several countries, and also in view of the increased uncertainty about the European project. Now, as all of you know, recent economic developments have not been encouraging in Europe. 2 weeks ago, the lead article of The Economist magazine had the title, in quote, "The Eurozone, the world's biggest economic problem." Now, I consider this an exaggerated assessment, yet it may become an accurate one in the absence of the appropriate policy response. This time last year, the consensus forecast was that growth in the Eurozone would be moderate and likely to be fragile and uneven, and the prediction proved to be correct. We had very moderate growth in the first half of the year, which proved to be fragile. And in the second half, economic activity is weakening, while inflation has declined to a very low rate. It was about 0.3% in September and 0.4% in October. And although moderate economic growth is forecast for next year in 2016, all assessments of the outlook point to downside risks to growth. serious concerns have been expressed by many that the Eurozone will experience secular stagnation with unemployment remaining unacceptably high. The probability of deflation and recession in the quarters ahead has increased. Clearly, prosperity is not around the corner. In assessing the growth prospects in Europe in the wake of the crisis, and in designing the appropriate policies to improve them, it's important to understand and keep in mind the various factors that have been adversely affecting economic activity and are posing obstacles to higher economic growth. These include, first, structural and institutional weaknesses of various kinds which impair market efficiency and limit potential growth. And they do include the factors that constrain a nation's dynamism in the sense articulated by Edmund Phelps. Second, and related to the first point, a likely decline in trend productivity growth is projected in the coming years, accompanied by unfavorable demographics. Third, there is high both public and private debt in several European countries, which respectively constrain the use of fiscal policy as stabilization tool and have a dampening effect on aggregate private demand. Fourth, the process of balanced deleveraging and repair and the need to strengthen the capital of banks has also had a constraining effect on activity. And fifth, and this is my last point, the persisting, though diminishing financial fragmentation across the Eurozone, which combined with the deleveraging has severely limited the provision of credit in several countries, including Greece, despite the very accommodative policy of the ECB. Now, I did not present this list to you of the obstacles to growth in order to depress you. Those growth-constraining factors have important policy implications, and let me point only to two of them. The first is that in order to achieve higher and sustained growth, it is necessary that policy action should be taken on various fronts simultaneously, so as to overcome these impediments to growth and strengthen both aggregate demand and supply. One type of policy, structural, fiscal, monetary, will not suffice to achieve stronger growth over the medium term and the long term. And the second point that I would like to stress is to recognize that Europe today faces a twin growth challenge. There is a need to strengthen the economic recovery, address potential deflation risks, and address also reduce the high unemployment rate promptly. At the same time, there is a need to increase the capacity of the European economy to grow over the long term. Different types of policies are best suited to achieving the medium-term and long-term growth objectives. Now, at the current juncture, implementing the appropriate policies and overcoming the impediments to growth are complicated by the evolving political landscape, where populism and short-termism are in excess supply. They are affected by the reduced public confidence in European institutions and the increased uncertainty about the future of European integration. So let me now turn to the role and effectiveness of policies currently being implemented in Europe and on the need for additional further action, starting with the ECB's monetary policy. At present, the European Central Bank is facing two serious challenges. The first is to achieve its primary objective, to maintain inflation close to, though less than 2% over the medium term. The second challenge is to repair the monetary policy transmission mechanism, which has been impaired by several reasons, notably the deleveraging of banks and the continuing financial fragmentation across the Eurozone, partly reflecting fiscal imbalances in several countries. Now, with current inflation at a very low level of 0.3% and projected inflation over the next 2 years well below the ECB's operational target, the bank has been implementing an expansionary monetary policy to stimulate aggregate demand and to ensure that inflation expectations are well anchored to the policy objective of 2%, so as to contain the risk of deflationary spiral. And at the same time, measures are taken so that a single monetary policy is transmitted homogeneously across the Eurozone, which has not been the case. Now, as you know, the ECB's monetary policy has been very accommodative over the past few years. Currently, the main policy rate is essentially zero, it's 0.05%, and the rate on the central bank deposit facility is negative. That's an innovation, actually. Moreover, various non-standard measures have been taken to support activity, address deflation risks, and improve the transmission of policy. In particular, over the past 2 months, the bank has taken 2 additional non-conventional measures. First, the targeted long-term financing operations, the so-called TLTROs, which will be conducted for 2 years until summer of 2016, and which aim at providing liquidity to banks conditional on their lending to the private sector. And second, the purchases of asset-backed securities and covered bonds. Mario Draghi has repeatedly emphasized, and he did so last week as well, that the ECB, in quote, the ECB Governing Council is unanimous in its commitment to using additional unconventional instruments within its mandate. Now, are the measures taken by the ECB appropriate? Will they prove effective and sufficient to achieve the objectives? In my view, the measures are appropriate because they aim at encouraging credit provision by banks, especially to small and medium-sized firms. Bank lending to the private sector has been shrinking in the Eurozone. It was minus 2% over the past few months, reflecting both subdued demand but also constraints on the supply. And the credit squeeze has been a major factor that has dampened aggregate demand in activity. Restoring bank credit provision, in principle, is the right approach to provide monetary stimulus and improve the growth performance of the Eurozone over the medium term. I said they are appropriate. Will the measures taken so far be effective? My answer is broadly positive, but also qualified. The targeted LTROs, which will be carried out, as I said, for the next 2 years, should improve significantly banks' funding and capacity to provide credit over time. However, the effectiveness of the ABS purchases depends on the developments of the ABS market, whose size is limited and affected by the regulatory framework. So more will have to be done in order to enhance the efficacy of the ECB interventions in that market. And the ECB is actually taking initiatives to this end. But keep in mind that both measures, the positive impact of both measures, will become visible gradually over time. Now, will these measures be sufficient? We cannot be certain at this stage. Whether more monetary stimulus will be necessary depends the impact on activity and price developments of various factors and shocks, as well as on the economic policies to be pursued at the national and at the European level. So the answer is conditional on forecasts and judgments. Many analysts and commentators believe that more monetary action is needed to revive the Eurozone economy, and they emphasize the need of quantitative easing along the lines of the Federal Reserve's market operations. The need for such monetary policy will depend on the impact of the factors that I mentioned, and whether the banks will be extending more credit in the coming quarters now that the outcome of the ECB stress test is known. Overall, my view is that more policy actions are necessary to improve the growth performance of the Eurozone. But I would argue that the type of action needed to push growth cannot rely and should not rely only on monetary policy, and in particular on quantitative easing in the form of purchases of government bonds. Leaving aside the potential political and legal factors which may pose constraints on the purchase of government bonds by the ECB, the effectiveness of this form of quantitative easing may prove to be relatively modest given the structure of the financial markets in continental Europe, which is different from that of the US. A reduction in government bond yields by, say, 1 percentage point on average is likely to have a moderate effect, which will take a fairly long time to materialize on aggregate demand. More generally, and this is my last point on monetary policy, a substantial further easing of monetary policy by the ECB, unless clearly warranted on the basis of forecast and risk assessment, also entails certain potential risks that should not be underestimated. Let me point to two such risks. One is that the risk of excessive and prolonged monetary stimulus is that it may foster complacency and increase the propensity of some governments to postpone the structural reforms and budgetary policies necessary for achieving higher growth in the longer run. We have witnessed such risk materializing in the past, and we have experienced the consequences. And another potential and desirable side effect is the contribution of such policy to excessive risk-taking, the mispricing of financial assets that can lead to imbalances and distortions with adverse consequences for financial stability. I would repeat what I said a moment ago, that we have witnessed this risk materializing in the past and have experienced the consequences. So, all in all, the conclusion I derive from these thoughts is that although the ECB's current monetary policy is appropriate and absolutely essential for supporting the recovery and bringing the economy closer to potential growth path, it cannot be the only game in town. And this leads me to the last part of my remarks. Monetary policy cannot be expected to achieve objectives that it cannot realistically achieve given the instruments at its disposal. It has to be complemented and supported by reforms and structures and institutions at both the national and the European level. The urgent need to implement more growth-enhancing reforms in several Eurozone countries, both in the so-called periphery, but also in France and in Italy, has been repeatedly emphasized. There is no time for me to elaborate, but the arguments advanced by Edmund Phelps provide convincing reasons of why this has to be done. Without such reforms, it will not be possible to achieve and sustain significantly higher growth in the longer run. Moreover, I believe that some of these reforms will also contribute to reviving economic activity in the short run as well. Now, the necessary structural changes differ across Eurozone countries, but there are several common elements. Reforms to improve the functioning of markets, increase the efficiency of the public administration, and enhance human capital all are needed to raise productivity and competitiveness. But the growth performance in our own country, as well as in the Eurozone as a whole, crucially depends on the introduction of additional institutional reforms and joint economic policy actions at the European level. In my view, there is a need to take additional steps towards completing the institutional structure of the Economic and Monetary Union and to strengthen its economic foundations. Over the past 3 years, far-reaching actions have been taken by European leaders and institutions to resolve a crisis by addressing the so-called systemic causes of it, that is, the weaknesses that have been revealed in the institutional design and the policy framework of EMU. And among the concrete actions taken, two are particularly important for improving economic performance and protecting financial stability: the introduction of a reinforced economic governance framework that will help to coordinate economic policies, and second, the creation of a banking union. Having said that, I believe it's essential that additional steps are taken towards further financial, fiscal, and economic integration in the Eurozone. One such step is to complete the banking union. The establishment of the European Banking Union with a single supervisory authority at the ECB which is becoming fully operational this month, is a fundamental institutional reform that will reinforce the foundations of monetary union and boost economic growth over the medium and long term. But the beneficial effects will become manifest through various channels, including the mitigation, but not the elimination of financial fragmentation in Europe. Nevertheless, although the agreed banking union includes more necessary elements and has many attractive features, it also incorporates rules and provisions that imply a limited sharing of risks at the European level, and it may not contribute sufficiently to protecting financial stability and supporting economic activity in the long run. Hence, the establishment of the banking union, although it is a tremendous achievement, has to be completed and improved, notably by creating a single deposit insurance for the Eurozone as a whole, and by amending certain features of the single resolution mechanism for failing banks. And what can we expect from such improvements? We can expect that such enhancements will ensure the full substitutability of deposits across banks in all Eurozone countries. They will foster the completion of the single market for financial services. They will eliminate rather than mitigate financial fragmentation, and they will improve financial conditions throughout the Eurozone, thereby supporting economic growth both in the periphery as well as in the Eurozone as a whole. But creating a fully fledged banking union will require more risk sharing by member states and a higher degree of fiscal integration in the Eurozone. Ladies and gentlemen, I think eventually, we don't know when, but inevitably, the completion of the EMU and the effective function of monetary union will require the establishment of some form of fiscal union. The nature and the features of the fiscal union which is necessary for ensuring the robustness and the efficient functioning of EMU is a complex and difficult issue, and it involves decisions that are profoundly political. Since the creation of a political union is not envisaged, the practical and immediate task is to define the kind of policies and the appropriate institutional setup for a more integrated fiscal framework in Europe. This could include the joint issuance of public debt up to a certain level and subject to conditions. It could involve the pool financing of expenditure of certain public goods, such as infrastructure projects or a joint defense capacity. And it could also involve a Eurozone-wide unemployment insurance system to address cyclical fluctuations due to asymmetric shocks. Now, there is no doubt that taking decisions and actions towards fiscal integration will involve addressing challenging and politically sensitive questions. So the approach to be adopted is likely to be a step-by-step process to be triggered and justified by circumstances and immediate needs. In my view, strengthening the growth performance and improving the functioning of monetary union would require, sooner or later, a bolder approach. And the current state and future prospects of the European economy may actually provide an opportunity for decisions in the right direction. And this observation really brings me to my last point. At the current juncture, there is a strong case for a substantial increase in public investment at the European level, which can be financed by the European Investment Bank, whose funding may be facilitated by European Central Bank operations. Such investment, probably designed and effectively implemented, would have a positive effect on both aggregate demand and aggregate supply. I see this as an essential component of Europe's growth strategy. And let me say here that infrastructure investment does not mean building bridges and highways, definitely not only building bridges and highways. It also means investment in energy networks, investment in research and development, in education, in activities that promote the completion of the single market and therefore create an environment that fosters competition and innovation. This view has been receiving increasing support, importantly by European leaders in the recent summit. Prompt and effective implementation of these conclusions is, of course, crucial, and I hope that progress will be made before markets force us to take the necessary actions under pressure. Ladies and gentlemen, I have adopted a European perspective, and I have focused my remarks on policies and reforms that can contribute significantly to improving growth, stability, and hence prosperity in its member states. How likely, how realistic is that the more far-reaching institutional reforms that I outlined in the second part of my remarks will actually be introduced in the foreseeable future? In an environment of reduced public trust in European institutions and reduced declining support for further European integration, developments that have been reflected in the political landscape of the Union. The answer to this question should take into account the evidence that shows that the increase in Euroscepticism is mainly a consequence of the severe and prolonged weakness of the European economy and of the rise of unemployment to record levels. And it also reflects the perception, the public perception, that European leaders and institutions have not managed the crisis effectively and in a timely manner. I don't share this perception, but this is the public perception. And public attitudes influence political decisions, and hence they may influence the pace and extent of the reforms to be implemented. But in my view, the right way forward is to break this adverse feedback between, on one hand, the state of the economy and public attitudes toward European integration, and to break this adverse feedback by implementing policies and institutional reforms to improve real incomes and reduce inequality in a meaningful and sustained way. As Professor Phelps has stressed, a growth-enhancing transformation of the economy requires the development of values and institutions that can underpin the appropriate design of market structures and create an environment that fosters growth, that fosters innovation and job creation in a competitive world. This may sound abstract, but I think it is profound and it's very real. We have to seriously consider in Europe and here at home how we can foster the values and institutions that provide the foundations for sustained prosperity and, as Ned have said, en masse flourishing. Thank you.
We follow and continue. As you know, we will have question and answer, so I will ask to the speakers to focus on the specifics. And I would like to now ask our Minister of Finance, Professor Gikas Hardouvelis, to present to us the policies, the measures, and the structural changes that Greece is implementing to be able to have economic growth and social well-being.
Thank you, Stelios. Dear guests, thank you for coming. Dear Prime Minister, ambassadors, head of the Federation of Greek Industries, professors, ministers. I'm happy to be here, and I'll try to be quick. Perhaps I will probably not read, risking that I'll regret it in the end. But listening to the two speeches, just to put a framework of what I will say, I would say Professor Phelps' speech was about how do you make a speedboat run faster? What kind of fuel do you need? That's sort of the energy. Professor Papadimos told us about the old boat of Europe and what kind of items you need to fix to make it run fast. And I guess the Greek economy is probably a rowboat. It was a rowboat in the past with its passengers, the families there kind of half asleep. And the rowboat was on borrowed money that at some point it tipped over And over the past 5 years, we were almost drowned. Somebody tried to keep us away from drowning. The last 2 years, we've been above the water, and now we're trying to swim so we can go back to our boat. Perhaps we sent our kids that are fixing it already, so we can start the game of rushing with a boat, and perhaps that would become a European boat, and the super boat that Professor Phelps talked about. So I will essentially focus my comments on exactly at this stage where the Greek economy is, where you have just survived and you're learning to swim well, to catch the boat, fix it, and move on. And we've done a lot over the last 5 years. We know that it was a Herculean task. There were many sacrifices of the Greek people. Everybody knows this. I don't need to quote the numbers. With a huge unemployment rate, a drop in production by a quarter. And we survived because of the efforts of the government and because of European solidarity. Let's not forget that. And we worked on many fronts. We addressed the fiscal and debt sustainability problems. We addressed the international competitiveness issues that we always had. And we implemented not only fiscal reforms, but structural reforms. And I don't want to read and things that you do know, but I do want at least Professor Phelps to know that Greece had a deficit back in 2009 of 15.8% of GDP. And this deficit in 2014 is just over 3%. And next year, we will have a balanced budget. I mean, this was an amazing change that, of course, it was one of the causal factors of why we had a huge recession. But nevertheless, it was a big change. And regarding the debt sustainability, it is still an issue. The debt to GDP has gone up to about 175% of GDP. We do expect it to decline fast the moment growth picks up, okay? So we're going back to the boat, but we still have to pay the money for the people and our parents who used to be on the boat that didn't bother to fix it up or pay what they owed. Anyway, international competitiveness has improved over the last 5 years. Just to give you an example, I mean, I don't want to quote you numbers, but you do. For example, for the first time since 1948, we had a current account surplus. That was a year ago. When we say current account surplus, we mean we sold to foreigners goods and services more than we bought from them. Okay, that's perhaps due to the fact that we became poorer, so we're not buying goods, but also because we're more competitive and we are selling more goods, okay? And when it comes to structural reforms, just look at various indicators that are being published by various international organizations, and every year in and year out, we're doing better and better. In fact, the OECD has an interesting indicator that's being published every year of what's your effort in doing new reforms. And Greece ranks #1, I think, for a number of years in a row. Of course, we started from a low level, so it's easy to improve, but we're #1 in at least making the effort, okay? The effort from drowning to actually becoming a good swimmer and going over the boat is a huge effort. It doesn't take as much effort to find the fuel to make the steamboat run faster. It takes a lot of effort when you're drowning to go back up and start. Okay. So where we are now, well, obviously everybody knows that the economy has finally stabilized. We're expecting a growth rate of about 0.6% this year. 0.5% doesn't matter. It's stabilized. I know people complain. I mean, I am a politician now. I understand this. But they complain because of the past. Having a stabilization or having growth doesn't mean you're in a better situation than you were back in 2007 Okay, you're still in a worse situation. Your kid's still not finding a job. You're still out unemployed, and your income is still low. This is not going to happen overnight. Things are not going to change overnight. But finally, we have stabilized, and we have a chance to do it. We have a chance to finally do what Professor Phelps says in his book about mass flourishing. Okay? And if you look at, this economic sentiment indicator, is in a 5 or 6 year high at the moment. FDI, foreign direct investment, in 2013 surpassed the level of 2007. It was like 1.9 billion. It's not a lot. But I want to remind you that FDI was always a problem in Greece for decades. We never wanted foreigners to come in. We blocked them out, okay? We wanted our own shop with our own strict rules. We didn't allow competition. So FDI was naturally low. In other words, we had marked our position like wolves in that boat and didn't want to move, didn't want anybody else to move us, didn't want to change that boat that eventually sunk. Okay. So FDI is doing better. I mean, we had mega deals, as you know, capital share increases. For example, Eurobank 1.33. We have the transatlantic pipeline, 1.5 billion. You have huge tourism investments all over Greece. Okay, so something seems to be changing. And the financial sector, Professor Papadimos talked about this in extensive detail, is finally stabilizing. I mean, the Greek banks did pass the stress test. It was our big fear. And soon, I think they can revert to their primary role, which is lending. And remember, when it comes to lending, it takes two to tango. It's not just the supply of funds, it's the demand for funds. And I think bankers now say that finally the Greek business people, the Greeks, do want to come to the bank and extend their business and borrow new funds. So demand, we're finally seeing demand as well. Okay. So I don't want to say more about the economy, just to say where we see this going. Can we really fix the boat? Can we make it a boat that can compete? Well, the official forecast for next year is a growth rate of 2.9%. Some forecasters are more optimistic, in some banks at least. Some foreign forecasters are close to that. But more or less, I think the consensus is above 2%. So this is a decent rate of growth. We shouldn't, and where will it come from? If you look at the numbers, if you look at the official forecasts of the European Union, you realize that part of it is consumption, about 1.6%. So consumption is growing, but at a lower rate than total production. Remember, consumption was our problem. We were staying in that boat and eating up without making the boat bigger, without investing as much in the past. We were a consumer society with imported goods in the past. So in the future, we do need consumption to grow, but at a lower rate than investment or exports. That's the trick. This is almost an accounting identity. No matter what growth model you have for Greece, you have to fulfill this requirement. The consumption should grow, but at a less rate than investment or exports. So for next year, the prediction is that consumption will grow by 1.6%. Exports will grow, public consumption will decline, and I want to focus on this because it's related to what's being discussed, investment, which is being declining consistently over like 6 or 7 years. I think it was back in 2007 that the decline started. Will finally have a positive sign. We expect investment to grow by 11.7%. But for investment comes from business people, okay? It comes from foreigners. You do need cash. They have to have the money to invest. You do need the banks, but you also need the spirit that was discussed before. People, and you have to have the optimism. You have to see growth so you can risk. And you do need financial stability, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the trick. Will investment really switch signs finally? And are we really, are we have the right mind that we're fixing that boat? We're finally on the boat, and now we want to make sure it speeds up. I'll give you some numbers. I know I'll bore you, but I'll give you some numbers so you understand this issue. It used to be back in the 90s, when we entered the monetary union, that investment, before we entered the monetary union, was approximately, say, in 1996, around 18% of GDP. By 2007, these were the nice years. It had already gone up to 26.6% of GDP. That's a huge number for European standards. In Europe, the averages are like around 15% or something. Investment was growing at an average rate of 8.5% per year back then. And since the crisis, even actually before the international crisis, investment started declining, and the negative rates were like close to minus 18%. So that's really the trick. Now we do see signs that investment finally stabilizes. It's not real estate investment. That's dead. We all know that. And one of the reasons that investment was high in the past was because of real estate, okay? But now we do see that machinery and equipment is stabilizing, so there is a hope from the numbers that things will turn out right according to expectations. Now, what does the government do about this, about all this? Well, I'll say a few pointers and then finish. The Greek government actually wants to continue the structural agenda that did start with the second adjustment program. I know the word program is a bad word in the Greek vocabulary, but it was the thing that saved us from drowning, okay? And now to be able to swim and get off the old boat and fix it up, we need to continue that process. We cannot go back to our sleeping status and say, I'm okay. Okay, we have to do it on our own. So the new program, Greece is having a program that will continue the reforms of the MOU. And these are of two kinds, the efforts. They're horizontal policies that affect the economy across sectors, and also some sectoral policies, because naturally you have some advantages as a country. You need to dwell on them and push them if you can. And the horizontal policies that have to be continued, whether the Troika is here, whether they go away, or whether they bark from going away with post-program reviews, we have to do it because we want it, because we understand, because we're about to drown, that we need to do something else. So it's continuing the process of abolishing entries to barrier and red tape in various professions and markets, and strengthening the antitrust legislation. It's continuing the improvement in the effectiveness of the public sector. I mean, there's a huge reform in the public sector right now. The minister was here before. He missed my praise. He's doing well. He's trying to push the reform agenda. We have to understand that in the public sector, which was abandoned for ages and ages, we have to have incentives. We have to incentivize the employees of the public sector. And we cannot rely on the 30% of public employees that work as hard and even harder than in the private sector, but they get paid 1/5 the money. And they get paid the same as the lazy guy who doesn't even show up sometimes. So we need to fix that. And we need to fix the ministries in a way where people can transfer, you can have mobility, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, that has to continue. We need to strengthen horizontal policy institutions. I heard the word before. If you look at the academic literature, the big fight among academicians over the last 20 years is it the educational system that matters most, or is everything other institutions like the judiciary or the tax reform, et cetera, et cetera? Frankly, it doesn't matter. We have to work on all of these institutions across the board. The MOU started. We need to push it. You cannot have sustainable growth in any country if you don't have institutions. And institutions are built by the citizens of that country. And we should stop blaming politicians, because politicians are our own flesh. We are also the politicians. We should be looking in the mirror whenever we attack people. We should stop bickering, and we should start being positive and fix this country even when the Troika goes away. So strengthening institutions is important. Now, something more practical. I know you want to hear something more practical from me. The government insists on that. We know it. We need to reduce the tax rates in a targeted way. The population is overtaxed, was overtaxed because of the crisis. The usual suspects were overtaxed, so we need to cure that. But we need to fix and rationalize the system. And it's not only capturing the underground economy, it's also having a rational system that will stay. That's how FDI will come, because the foreign company wants to see a stable tax system for them to come. Now, these are the horizontal measures that we will continue. The sectoral stuff, I think we ought to do them. As an economist, if you ask economists, they don't like to talk about sectors. But we live in a country that happens to have sunshine, that everybody wants to visit, that has Amphipolis, okay? So we need to do something and try to combine forces and bring in cash, bring income. So definitely the tourism sector, we've been pushing it. Definitely the shipping sector, I see ship owners here. I mean, perhaps the Chinese have taken us over, I'm not sure, but we used to be the #1 in terms of nationality, and we need to bring the ship owners home. Why are they in Singapore? Okay? We should have them hire our kids and those high salaries, and not the kids of the Singaporeans or the Chinese. Okay? So we need to push research, technology, and innovation. I say we need to. There we're not doing well. In Europe we're not doing well, and most of R&D is being driven by the public sector. That's a structural characteristic of the Greek economy because we don't have large companies. We were sleeping on that boat. We like to have one family company. We never tried to be competitive abroad in the past. That has to change. So energy and environment is another area. A lot of people know about this. The primary sector, which was destroyed by the subsidies of the European Union over the last 3 decades, and the agro-food business has to be remunerated. The pharmaceutical industry is doing well. It can be pushed. It was affected by the PSI, by the way, but we know we have a good industry that we can push. Definitely tradable stuff. The market is outside Greece. The Greek now is poorer, doesn't have the money, there's not much aggregate demand, but the money is outside. We need to look at the world. There are billions and billions of consumers out there we can tap on. So let me close by saying the Greek government already discusses the details of the new post-program relationship with our official partners. This is not news. In this new era, from January 2015 onwards, Greece will tap the markets in order to cover its financing needs, but it will also have available the so-called enhanced conditions credit line in one form or the other. It's being decided at this point, and over an interim period of about 6 to 12 months. This is not a clean exit like Portugal or Ireland. We still need to go through this intermediate period, and we need to avoid turbulence in the financial circumstances. I think the second adjustment program, as I told you, will continue with our own program, which has to be our own, and it will become our own the moment the Greek citizen will see growth, and he or she will associate the fact that they have money in their pockets and that the kid gets a job with the fact that the reforms, that they were consistent and persistent on the reforms. They have to make this association. And I'm confident of this growth outlook. I think, as I said before, reforms will continue, and we will push for a better institutional environment, more openness. And Greece's determination to reform its economy will increasingly be recognized in a virtuous cycle circle by both the markets and our official creditors. But confidence, of course, does not imply complacency. Making that boat into a speedboat, in other words, cannot be done by sleeping on the wheel and fighting about what's inside that boat that you have borrowed anyway. Okay, you got to fix the boat and find the fuel and push it forward. So confidence does not imply complacency. The government will continue to work hard in order to improve the economy's prospects. Thank you.
Following the very optimistic presentation by our Minister of Finance, I would like to ask the former Minister of Development and Cooperation and Minister of Defense, Nikos Dendias, who had developed a dynamic framework of legislation and a series of financial instruments to support the liquidity which is so important for innovation and new products in Greece, to tell us some of the measures that were really taken to improve innovation.
Well, thank you, dear President. Would you please allow me to answer from my seat?
You have always been very efficient and practical. Thank you.
No, it's even more practical than that. I don't dare dream of following a Nobel laureate and two professors into the podium. So, well, ladies and gentlemen, it is. I'm not anymore the Minister of Development. I'm now the Minister for National Defense. But please allow me to say that no country is stronger than its economy. And I think the late USSR proved the point. And there's another thing I think almost everybody in this room would agree, is that the development model of Greece, which was based on statism, on European Union funds, and on state-controlled private initiative, has failed us completely. And now that we are getting out of the crisis, it's really the time to change our model. There are very many good things happening to the Greek economy, and our Minister of Finance has indicated many of them just before me. But I think, again, we will all agree that there are also indicators of concern. I will only mention two of them. One is exports. Currently, exports, excluding shipping and oil products, is just 1/3 of our imports. And the second thing, which is even worse, is that innovation contribution to GDP is 0.47%, practically zero. Now, not being a professor and being a member of the government and having held the post of Minister of Development for 130 days, I left an inheritance to my successor and friend, Kostas Krekas. And I will take 5 minutes of your time to tell you what is that inheritance. First of all, we had, and we do have as a government, to set a strategic target. And I believe that our strategic target is to establish entrepreneurship as our principal development instrument. I was preaching that Greece needed the creation of 100,000 new businesses, and also that we had, which is common ground, we had to create a friendly environment for the survival of the viable companies, and last but not least, we had to liberalize the market from unnecessary administrative burdens. And there are many of them in the Greek economy. On that last thing, may I please tell you that if things go as planned, I believe that in the next 3 months, 60% of the licenses needed to operate in the Greek economy will be stricken off by one ministerial decision, co-signed by the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Development, following a survey prepared by the World Bank, which will be given to us in late November, early December.
Minister, these are breakthrough news. That's excellent.
We appreciate that.
But axis of intervention. We have to support the framework for innovation. We have to access facilitation to entrepreneurship, and we have to support liquidity. And when I say framework for support of innovation, there are very, very practical things that we are doing and we can do. First of all is the integration of research in the framework of development, even in the Ministry of Development. Currently, you may not know, but the Secretariat for Research is in the Ministry of Education, by the way, as the Atomic Energy Committee, which is, so that has to move. And also we have to connect research with the market, with the enterprises, Mr. President. And we don't do it by improvising. We follow a very clear roadmap. That was created for the ministry by YOSMA. YOSMA is an organization that in the last 20 years turned Israel from an agricultural kibbutz economy to what the Financial Times yesterday described as the startup nation. We can do that, we can achieve that as well. Pre-seed capital, seed capital, venture capital has to be an everyday word in our business environment. Right now, they're almost non-existent. And also, from our part, from the state, what we're doing is we are changing almost completely the way the structural funds are being used. Structural funds known in the Greek language as ESPA. So we're speaking about the new ESPA. We have to turn from grants, which was the vast majority, to very targeted financing and to royalties kept by the state. If one in each 500 startups becomes successful, then we would be able to take back all the money we would have spent to use it to start the cycle all over again. And also, ladies and gentlemen, we have to create incubators. Greece needs 30, there are not many, 30 new incubators. We're in contact with the transfer offices of Harvard, of MIT, of Cambridge, of Fraunhofer Gesellschaft, in order to get the best available know-how in the world on how to do all those things. We have to simplify and facilitate the procedures for creation of new business entities. The things going forward, I won't take much of your time in mentioning that, except that mentioning that already you can register in the YEMI, in the registry for companies electronically, and also you can register a patent electronically in Greece. Up to a month ago, most Greek startups were preferring to register their patents in the United States. It was easier and cheaper, funny as it sounds. And also, we need additional liquidity in the market. And with the help of apart from the banking system, which is recapitalized and ready to help, together with our European friends, first of all, the German Republic, and then France, we are creating a new model through the IFG, the Institute for Growth, in which we could address special needs and market failures. And we hope that next year we could turn IFG to a development bank, not with retail banking, but a special bank which could address the needs of a startup economy. I will finish my small remark saying that the Samaras government proposes a new, complete narrative to the Greek society. We do that because that is the only way forward. We have to create a new narrative and a new culture. And if you would allow me, Professor Phelps, to quote from your mass flourishing You write in the epilogue, without a supportive culture, these steps, Professor Phelps before mentioned the steps, these steps will not be sufficient. They will not even be taken. So, ladies and gentlemen, our primary task is to create that culture. Thank you very much.
Nico, following your inspiring presentation, I would like to ask Kostas Apostolidis, who is the man who started a company from scratch, and he has reached the point of selling over 160 million per year, 95% out of Greece, and he is a living example of what we're discussing here, the concepts. Costa, how did you really do it? What did motivate you? How did you do that?
Well, from the beginning, we positioned our company to create and manufacture innovative products, preferably proprietary products, products that are protected with patents. Why did we do that? We did that because that's how you create excessive value to the customer. That was our distinct differentiation. And we hired people, the best we could, and we gave them room to play, to create. So how do we hire? We get hundreds of CVs to choose from, and we hire like a young graduate who, on the CV he sent us, he attached a paper he wrote about one of our patents, analyzing the key aspects of the patent and proposing improvements and also the scope also of its applications. So not only improvements for the patent technical, but also for improving the applications of that. So that's the kind of people we want. And I think that's the kind of people you want, and everybody. We want people who are not passive. We want people who are passionate. And then you have leadership. Leadership that is demanding. Leadership that sets high goals to its people. Leadership that is never complacent. So now you have, let's say, the people, and then you need direction. And the direction got to be towards the customer, because we got to be facilitating the customer, be good to the customer. And how do you do that? You do it by focusing on the product, relentlessly, making the product better, not looking on ourselves for ourselves. For example, 2 months ago, our US sales team asked our development department in Greece to come up with a product to be used at 50 meters high on mobile towers in the US. The salesmen loved the prototype, and they were ready and eager to sell it. And our president asked our engineers to go back and come with a new design. Why? Because the product was to be installed at 50 meters high. And the engineers came back the following day with that solution, so they performed in less than 24 hours. But Okay, let's say you have smart people, dynamic people, but then you need a dynamic environment. Because without any dynamic environment, any dynamism, you cannot do anywhere.
On this issue, Costa,
Sure.
you have been the exclusive supplier of Federal Aviation Authority, while it's very difficult to have R&D and to encourage creativity in Greece and innovation. Tell us a little bit, what is the situation with the R&D in Greece, and why is there such a problem? You faced it.
Okay, as it is now in Greece, companies that do work on R&D are rewarded only for spending, not for success. So, for example, if you do R&D spending, and of course your goal is not to fool around, you want to make an innovative product, and for example, you get the cure of cancer, then if you make that product in Greece, you are taxed usually. Now, what is the reward if you spend in R&D? So for every 100 euro you spend, you deduct 8 euro from your taxes. And that was 2 years ago, 13. In comparison, in England is 24.
What keeps you in Greece?
Sorry?
What keeps you in Greece?
Well, we have faith in the country. And we think that's a forum to bring those problems to the decision makers. And we will keep on doing that.
That's a pretty good forum to do it.
Thank you. Do you want me to go on? Or? Okay.
I will come back to you. We are going to start question and answers, but there were several people who asked me to intervene, and I couldn't ask for someone best than their German ambassador, Peter Schoof. Please do.
Is this all right? Can I?
Please stand up. You're short. We can see you.
Yeah, I'm very short. Well, thank you very much. First of all, Stelios, when you asked that the German ambassador asked the first question, you know that I was not very comfortable, especially given the theme of the debate tonight, but with your charm you have convinced me. And let me just make two observations, one anecdotal observation and one more policy observation. The anecdotal observation would pertain to Greece. You know that this year both Chancellor Merkel and our President Joachim Gauck were visiting Greece, and they both had asked to meet business, but they didn't want to meet the established business. They wanted to meet young start-uppers between 25 and 35, which posed a big problem to the embassy because we had to find these people, which in the end was not so difficult. Now, the good thing or the encouraging thing that we found out from these talks and debates with these young people was that when asked about why did they do what they did, why did they decide to build up a startup company, it had to do with, and this brings me to Professor Phelps's observations, it had to do with self-determination, not so much with expectations of wealth and prosperity, but the usual answer we would get was, well, I wouldn't like to end up like my parents in some government office. And I think this is a very interesting observation because it shows that there is some spirit in this country on which dynamism can be built. Now, the second observation I would like to make pertains to policy, and this does not so much concern Greece alone, but rather Europe at large. We have, on innovation, I think, a very poor record, but I think we have a number of new tools to address the problem. The empirical statistics show that if you compare the US, for example, I see the US ambassador here, and Europe, the number of applications for patents is slightly higher in Europe than in the US. But the granting of patents is 4 times as high in the US as here. It takes 4 times less time. It's 4 times cheaper. And this is not about the more interesting question, which is then the next one is, once a patent is granted, what's going to happen to it? And we all know that things like the fax machine, the MP3 player, were all things that were invented in Europe, but of course, as we all know, they were made to a market success in the US. So this brings us to the question that we have to, I think, have a fresh look, all of us in Europe, not only in Greece, to this relationship between business, industry on the one hand, research, financing, and government. And I think this is a very critical issue where the European Union has also developed new tools. There is something which is not known by many people, but it's called the Innovation Union. It attempts to mobilize resources. It attempts to look at the regulatory framework, which was one of the biggest problems. Minister Dendias, you mentioned that people go to the US to register their patents and not here. At least this was the case until the past. And I do believe that it is important that we also look at some of the new tools that we have. For example, we have in the European Union now a new program under the new EU budget called Teaming for Excellence, which allows institutions that work in the applied research area, linking business in one country, to work together with actors in another country. And my wish would very much be that Greece also takes the initiative to exploit these new opportunities that we have. Thank you very much.
I would like to go now to Deputy Minister Mavraganis, because one of the issues for the R&D has to do with taxation and the motives that we give for the people to innovate. Minister Mavraganis, what are the new policies or changes we're doing to improve the economic growth in this country?
I think that many things have been done and many more have to be done. First, I would like to say that we have provided some extra incentives for research and development in Greece. I mean, higher amortization rates. But you should take into account that tax incentives should be targeted and should be related to innovation. If we provide tax incentives or cut tax rates, this does not mean that automatically will bring the results we want. For instance, if you look at other Balkan states, they have very low tax rates. They have not become Silicon Valleys. So what we need is to correlate incentives and innovation. For instance, I can mention one innovation, and above all, incentives must be related to structural reforms. Now we're discussing in the Parliament new legislation on the new accounting law of Greece. After 35 years, we change it and we make it very close to the European standards. What we have introduced is the electronic invoicing. It's a new business. For the first time, you can have electronic invoicing in Greece, which means that you need support from other businesses who will verify, for instance, invoices. And we can introduce a new market, new businesses. Or we can use it as a tool to close the VAT gap, as the latest European Union studies say so. And one more thing, I think that innovation is a problem in the European Union, because as the German ambassador mentioned, we have studies by the European Commission saying what? That we invent products or we have ideas, but the products are effectively used and promoted in the United States. Why? Because European businessmen are very conservative. They want very quick profits, and we don't attract researchers, young researchers, and we don't use financial vehicles like venture capital, as the United States use. So we need some focusing on innovation and incentives, but we must follow the pattern that has been used in the United States in this area. Thank you.
Thank you. Please allow me to bring a quality of life philosophical perspective in this debate tonight. There was an inspiring force in my youth, Professor Theodosis Tassios, when I was a Polytechnion revolutionary. And you have been searching a lot about happiness and eudaimonia. So I wanted your point, Professor Tassios, about the connection of the Aristotelian eudaimonia and innovation.
Well, I'm sure, Mr. Chairman, that your kind invitation is highly biased by your engineering education, but nobody is perfect, doesn't matter.
Correct.
The thing is that we have to somehow combine the very concept of eudaimonia or happiness to dynamism and to innovation, because otherwise we will not be paid tonight. This is the subject of this discussion. That's why let me try to submit to the kind criticism of this audience the following ideas. First of all, with all my respect, I have some difficulties, Professor Phelps, to understand why solidarity is something which may create a difficulty or some kind of discouragement for dynamism. But I will create the positive aspect of it. What? He said, and this is my first point, I will be rather rapid, although teachers are talkative. Now, he said that dynamism, cultural elements, and imagination, and anti-corruption attitudes are favoring productivity. If this is so, ladies and gentlemen, this is a list of values, a list at least of value priorities. Therefore, if values, which are qualities, if these qualities are able to be transformed into quantities, which is productivity, which is economic results, this is a miracle. And I submit that the traditional economic science of economy should take into account when they optimize a function of the profit. And in this function, these value making and what we call personal happiness is absent. Therefore, we have from this Nobelist tonight an additional parameter for happiness, but not for romantic happiness, for happiness which is translated through dynamism and innovation into something which is tangible. One word, you mentioned Aristotle. Uncle Aristotle and nephew Thomas Jefferson, they said that in fact the aim, the telos of human endeavors is happiness. Of course, this is just an axiom. But look which way Aristotle is defining happiness. Not ευτυχία in the modern sense, but eudaimonia, which is the difference is very basic. He says that this is the energia tis, which is action towards pleasure. Action means activity, and activity for me is the equivalent of dynamism. I'm afraid I was already too talkative. I will not continue.
Professor, 40 years later, you still inspire me. Thank you. I would like now to go to another example that we have of innovation here, Maskos Veremis, who made from scratch upstream. Marco, tell us briefly how you made it your story.
Yeah, thank you. Upstream is a company that deals with technology like RakeUp. It has a presence in about 40 countries and the size of approximately $200 million in sales. The discussion today is basically how come this is a Greek company, and how did it work when I started this company 12 years ago. I think I'll start from the idea that the key thing missing, I guess, in the R&D sector in Greece is not so much the quality of engineers, because you have actually 4 very good universities, MEP, Patras, Crete, Volos, producing excellent engineers. In fact, some of their teachers are ex-MIT, Stanford professors who came back to Greece for emotional reasons primarily, or patriotic reasons. And they do send a lot of the top students, which by the way happen to be almost all outside Athens and Salonika, which I always find surprising, to top universities in the United States and Germany and the UK. So when I started Upstream, we had a rich pool of available top engineers to hire. That was not the problem. And Greece remains, I think, a statistical anomaly in terms of the number of good engineers you find in Stanford and MIT and these places compared to the size of Greece, right? You find a lot of Chinese, but that would be expected. Now, what we tried to do at Upstream was actually try and solve the riddle, because I'd worked in the UK for quite a while. How come Greeks prosper abroad and somehow never prosper here? And I guess the answer is quite straightforward. It's a matter of environment. Now, obviously, because no individual person, no entrepreneur can influence the environment in terms of a country, he can, however, influence the environment of a company, his company. So our emphasis actually in creating Upstream was more along the lines of how could we create a company, an environment, and a society, a micro-society that brings out the best in good Greek engineers and doesn't actually bring out the worst. And I think the key elements, in a nutshell, I think the main problem is collective working together. Very high individualism stands in the way of R&D and group effort in Greece. So no shortage of bright minds, but great difficulty in working together. The second thing is this drive for self-determination that the German ambassador talked about. This is a blessing and a curse, because I think, in Greece, one of the problems is not so much corporatism or bureaucracy for big corporations. It's just every Greek wants his own little shop, and you have far too many little shops. So if you're building a company, how can you get this self-determination to work whilst it benefits a company as opposed to the people leaving the company, setting up their own little company? And finally, how do you keep these people aware of the rest of the world? So 3 things really we tried to do. The first was, in fact, give them options. It's approximately 15% of shares within Upstream beyond institutional investors belong to employees. This worked incredibly well for Greek employees. They feel that they're owners. They can go back to their friends and say, well, I'm not actually an employee. I own part of this company. And this had a radical effect on productivity and group sort of identity. The second thing was actually being completely extrovert. 99% of our sales are abroad. These people travel a lot, so they have a good view of the world. And the final thing is in fact, giving them the opportunity to work with people from other countries, a very multinational group of people. That would be my
Thank you, Marco. I saw Professor Phelps taking a lot of notes, especially after Mr. Tassio's statement. Professor Phelps, your comments.
Well, I don't have a great deal to say. First, I want to thank my old dear friend, Professor Prime Minister Papadimos, for his kind references to my work and his moral support. And I want to thank the finance minister for his interesting comments also. I guess there were maybe there was one or two issues that I should address, and then I think I'll stop. One is that in response to the professor who spoke interestingly about Aristotle, I know you say something like Aristoteles or something like that. I was fascinated by his remarks, and I want to understand them better. But let me comment with regard to solidarity that by solidarity, I think the Europeans mean, and you may think otherwise, I think that they mean moving in lockstep, not allowing any social group to be left behind. But then, and that, of course, is a nice sentiment, isn't it? That's how corporatism started, because every one of its ideas is a very nice sentiment. It's warm and cuddly, and we feel good about those values. But then when it comes to the economy, the application of those values paradoxically gets economies into a lot of trouble. So it's just the opposite of don't try this at home. It's home where you should practice corporatism, but don't try it out in the economy. Now, in particular, I think that solidarity, the very notion of solidarity is used to justify a whole bunch of social protections. We need to protect them not because they deserve protection. We didn't say that. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not true. But we need to protect them because they will fall behind if we don't. So we need to protect them in the name of solidarity. But then, of course, once you start protecting masses of people in the name of solidarity, then pretty soon it becomes very easy to start protecting people who are sort of at the margin of this category. And it just metastasizes until it's such a common phenomenon that the government is protecting people that, oh, if it's protecting people over there, it must be that they would fall behind. Who has time to do the research to determine whether that's pure solidarity or whether it's irresponsible protection? And do I have another comment?
I thought that was quite brave, so that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that the comment was quite brave. I said that's quite okay.
Okay. Yes. I'll quit. I'll quit while I'm ahead. Okay. I'll just stop there. Okay. That's fine. That's good.
We always tend to keep the time at Harvard Business School, but we were late because not to our own doing, but because of the unfortunate demonstration. So, but I will give time for 3 very quick questions and very quick answers before we close. There were 3 people, Aristos Doxiadis, Antigone Liberaki, and Damianos Damianos. Aristo.
Professor, thank you for focusing on cultural aspects and on dynamism in that sense. I work very close to the ground. I work in this very small Greek industry, which is venture capital in Greece. We really are very few players there. And I work with startups, very early stage technology startups. And I can see how the culture of that small ecosystem has changed in 5 years. 5 years ago, it was very hard to find enough teams that had ambition, that had drive, and that had knowledge in order to come to us with interesting submissions. Within these 5 years, the ecosystem has transformed completely. It's not big, but it's much more qualitative, it's much more dynamic, and it is growing bigger. And it is on a learning curve, a steep learning curve. And I've been wondering why this has happened, and I think one of the very obvious things has nothing to do with policy. It has to do with the crisis in the sense of shifting incentives. Before the crisis, young people could make a better life in other professions or in the public sector. Now they cannot, and the most able among them are thinking of starting their own business, innovative business, because other types of businesses we always had. But here's the thing.
What is the question, Aristo?
Yes, here's the thing. What I observe is that all of our entrepreneurs have some sort of support from their families. They're middle-class people. Now, if you are saying that entitlements or support from the state damps the entrepreneurial spirit, I would argue that this is probably not the case for very poor people. Very poor people just do not have the time or the energy to set up innovative startups. They will go into subsistence, or they will go into populist politics and work against the culture of creativity, or they will migrate. So my sense is that you may be going too far arguing against social protection, in the sense that if you have no social protection, then you will actually taking a lot of people out of contention from becoming entrepreneurs.
Okay, I got the point. I think the I hope at least that the difference between us is just terminological. I certainly didn't mean to include under social protection, and obviously I was not directly referring to social insurance like Social Security or unemployment insurance or anything like that. I was talking about social protection of vested interests, of interest groups. I don't think of disadvantaged workers as an interest group. So we don't have any difference on that. That's fine.
Antigone Liberaki.
Right, thank you. Innovation and dynamism are very hard to imagine in a society where half of the population, women in that case, are relegated in a secondary auxiliary role. And Greece started before the crisis with a very low labor force participation of women. And crises are in the habit of speeding up developments, but they can do it in one way, speeding up forward, but also they can speed up development backwards, declining the participation of women in the economy. And my question really is, in a situation where more women are seeking work, like in Greece, we have the added worker effect very clearly as far as women are concerned. This is the good news, but the bad news that they can't find jobs. What do you think we should do, or rather stop doing, which might be more relevant, in order to ensure that women are not going to go back to the kitchen? And thanks, Telio, for involving another species in this discussion of feminist persuasion. Okay,
let me ask something let's have Kostas Apostolidis answer that. Costa, do you discriminate in RACAP between women and men, and how do you choose them?
We do not discriminate. Actually, we favor a little bit more to hire women.
Damiane, you asked a very interesting question about inequality. Please address it.
Yes, you seem to regard it, Professor Phelps, as a secondary issue. Innovation creates wealth. It lifts all boats. And if some people make more money, it doesn't matter. This is a little bit a Pollyanna fairy tale view of the world, I think. In reality, in the real world, inequality, especially if it is perceived as undeserved, does create friction, resentment, frustration, which depresses the dynamism.
Okay. Is it?
If I may continue one more.
Your question, I want.
Yeah, it's not, well, the question is, do you think that inequality is a secondary issue? Do you think that the concentration of wealth, especially idle wealth, that is not invested in real assets or in jobs, is a useful thing?
Well, thank you for the question. That's interesting. It's true, you've outed me. I don't think of the profit that an innovator makes. I don't think of that as an ill-deserved inequality. But on the subject of inequality, and by the way, I've written a whole book about low-wage workers and the need for low-wage subsidies and all that, so I don't, my credentials as somebody who cares about inequalities that really matter, inequalities at the low end, my credentials are substantial. But coming to this business about high wealth, which bothers some people a great deal, and I can see that there are cases and situations where it would indeed be quite a concern. With regard to that, my position, which I don't think I set out in my talk because I was determined to make it under the 20-minute limit. But what the page that I threw away explained that, or one of the pages that I threw away, explained that increased grassroots innovation, if that's allowed to happen by society, means that established wealth tends to get hit and displaced by new wealth, and that seems to me a good thing. But the other thing is that wages are pulled up relative to wealth, and that seems to me to be a very good thing on the whole, even from the point of view of inequality, because and the mechanism is, I'm not sure at this hour whether I can remember both mechanisms. I can surely do one. One mechanism is that when there's a lot of innovating going on, there's a high need, a high demand for the capital goods that will produce using the new method or produce the new product. And capital goods production tends to be very labor intensive. One of the great regularities in macroeconomics, I'm still a card-carrying macroeconomist, is that there is a strong correlation between the share of output that goes for investment expenditure. In other words, the ratio of investment expenditure relative to total output. There's a strong correlation between that and employment relative to labor force, and also employment relative to working age population. It's very clear that in the most corporatist economies that we see in the world, there's a tremendous unemployment problem. And this just comes from the sheer lack of investment activity. And the other mechanism that does swim into my head now is when you have a very innovative economy, that means that the established companies have to be on their toes. they have to engage in what we call defensive investment, and also, by the same argument, defensive innovation. But more to the point, they will also be keen on cutting their markups so as to be less of a target for outside innovators and be in a stronger position to protect themselves from outside innovators. In a corporatist economy that gives a lot of social protection to established corporations, they don't have to worry about innovation from outsiders. They're protected by the government. So then they raise their markups. They set very high markups, and you see a swollen level of profits relative to wages, and that leads also to a swollen level of wealth relative to wages, and it tends also to produce inequality in wealth because the big share owners are big wealth holders.
We would like to thank the National Bank of Greece for their hospitality, the excellent Elena Androuchos for organizing the event, but mainly I would like to thank our speakers, Professor Phelps, Professor Papadimos, Minister of Finance Handouvelis, Minister of Defense Dendias, Kostas Apostolidis, all of you for participating in tonight's unique event. And as we conclude today's presentation and debates, I would like to end with a specific positive note. All of our speakers and the participants, we identified the need to unleash the dynamism as a nation by starting to create and innovate as individuals and as a country. Values and education, policies and functioning institutions are the requirement. Our future of mass flourishing depends on each and every one of us. Thank you.